Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this Portscast. My name is Evan, and I'm here at Olompali State Historic Park in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as you probably know when you join us, it is California Biodiversity Week. It's really officially California Biodiversity Day, but there's so much diversity, so much stuff here in California that we're making a whole week out of it. So thank you again for joining. And what we're really here to do is celebrate the diversity of life here in California. And we're going to do that talking today for the next 45 minutes or so about acorns and oak trees. So acorn is essentially one big seed, and what it's going to grow into is an oak tree like this. And some people say an acorn is really this amazing thing. It's a tree in a box with its lunch. It's already got everything it needs to start growing. But in reality, it actually takes a lot more than that. It needs all of this diversity around. And what we're going to do is talk about what an acorn needs to grow into a tree, what it needs to survive and thrive, and how that actually helps other plants and animals, including humans, survive and thrive in this diverse ecosystem as well. So thank you again for joining, and let's dive into talking about what it's like, what it takes for this to thrive. But I'm going to back up a little bit, show you where we are, just give a little context. If you don't know where Olompali State Park is, so let's give you some photos. Start all the way back from outer space. There you can see California. You see the Pacific Ocean, which is where California really gets a lot of its weather patterns from. We get the cool, moist air coming off the ocean, and that gives us some fog on the coastline in the summer. But inland, we get a lot of warm, dry summers. The winters tend to be cold and rainy. And that's the California sort of weather system. And you see on there where that red dot is, up these hills here, you go over a few more hills and you would get to the ocean. So we get some of that coastal fog, but a lot of warm, dry days and beautiful days like today. Zoom in a little closer and you can see the San Francisco Bay. Down at the bottom is San Francisco. Over on the right side, you actually see where a river comes in. And that's the river delta. So the bay is really technically not a bay, but an estuary, the meeting of the ocean waters that come in here, the river waters that come out. And historically, if you go back 10,000 years until the 1800s, a lot of the land up here was actually part of the bay as well. So this area here was also water. And Olompali would have been right up against the edge of the bay back before the time of the gold rush. When the gold rush happened, there was a lot of extra dirt and rocks that came down that river that filled up the bay a little bit. But if you think historically, for most of the time that humans lived here, Olompali was right up against the bay. So these beautiful hills with grasslands and a lot of oak trees, oak woodlands, and other trees as well, right up against the bay. And then if you zoom in a little bit closer, here you get what it looks like. There I am where that purple dot is where I'm standing behind our visitor center. Let me even turn the camera a bit. So when I come back on the screen, maybe you can see that now, or I'll show you in a second. And then up into the hills here. And if you look down at the bottom of that photo, you can see the freeway. That's where the water would have come up to. So living here before the 1800s, before the gold rush, for tens of thousands of years, or at least 10,000 years, probably much longer, the Coast Miwok lived here. This is their land. There are still Coast Miwok throughout the area, and they had access to the bay waters, fish, reeds that would grow there, as well as access to the grasslands and the trees and the acorns and fresh water in a creek that runs year round through the valley. And here you can see, so back to my photo, you can see here's our visitor center here. It was a building was built in the 1800s. And I'll tell you more about all the people who have lived here, the different buildings that have been here, and the different way that people interacted with the ecosystem around them. But let's talk now about that ecosystem. What grows here? What lives here? Much of it starts with this, the nut, the acorn that can grow into a majestic oak tree like this. But like I said, it takes a lot for it to grow. An acorn alone isn't going to become a tree. If I put this in my pocket, it's not going to become a tree. It needs other things. First of all, it has to get somewhere to be planted. If you're a nut this big, how do you fall? You fall from the tree. How do you get up the hill to become a tree up on top of the hill? Acorns have a special strategy for doing that. So oak trees will grow these acorns. They're really hard. They've got a lot of tannins in them that make them last for a long time. And they've got a lot of protein and starches and sugars in them. So they're great food. So a lot of animals like to gather acorns and store them for the winter. And when you gather an acorn, whether it's a person or a squirrel or a bird, you take those acorns, you move them somewhere else, you hold on to them, and then you eat them later. But what if you forget where you planted it? What if you hide it somewhere in the dirt? You dig a hole, put it there, and you go back later, but you can't find it. That's how these acorns find their way up the hills. It's how they find their way into new habitats. And oak trees are able to spread themselves around. Once they're planted, though, they need more. So I think most of you joining now are actually in classrooms. So if you're sitting with some other students, or if you're sitting alone, maybe just think to yourself or write down. Let's talk for just about 30 seconds. Turn to a student next to you and talk about what do you think that acorn needs to grow into an oak tree? What are some of the things that a nut needs to grow into a tree? Okay, take a few more seconds to wrap up. Think about what do you need to grow into a tree? Okay, I'm going to tell you now some of the things I'm guessing you have probably got some of these answers. Um, One of them is you need water. Seeds need water to grow. Oak trees need water, so that could come from rain, from natural springs and rivers and creeks, but they'll need that water. They need sunshine. That light in the sky, the energy and warmth from the sun is what powers plants and algae. They can convert that energy from the sun into the growth that they need, into sugars and starches. They also need nutrients. So they're going to need minerals and vitamins, just like humans and other animals do. They need those nutrients. So some of those things that plants need, an oak tree is going to need sunshine, water. They need fresh air, and they need those nutrients. And there's a process called photosynthesis. When the sunlight hits the trees, they're able to turn that energy, use that energy from the sun to turn the water and the air, the carbon dioxide in the air, into the sugars and the starches that they need to grow and the energy they need to grow. And when they do that, they give off oxygen, which is something that then humans need. I'm going to point out now also there's a Q&A function, teachers. It looks like a few folks have been using that. If you put questions in there, at the end, I will get to those. I'll look through, see some of those questions, and do my best to answer as many as I can. So let me share some photos now of what it looks like, the things that trees need. and how they get those different things to support the life and make them healthy. So first off, sunshine. So there's a photo, that's a valley oak tree. Valley oaks have these bright green leaves when the sun hits them, and that green, the chlorophyll, a chemical in their leaves that can help convert sunshine into energy. We said trees also need water. And one of the ways they get water is obviously from rain. Another would be from rivers or creeks. But oak trees have a cool way of gathering water from the fog. They're not great at doing themselves, but lichen can grow on the trees. So this stuff hanging off the tree that looks like moss is actually lichen. It's a combination of algae and fungus that'll grow on a tree. It doesn't hurt the tree, and in fact, it helps the tree because that lichen will gather fog. And here's a close-up of lace lichen. It'll capture the fog and form drips that'll drip off of the lichen onto the ground. So on a day when it doesn't rain, it'll be wet underneath the tree. And that's how the oak tree can get some extra water, even during the dry months. And here is a turkey. So how does that relate to what trees need? Well, I said trees need nutrients. They need minerals, things that come from other living things. But trees can't go out and eat an animal. But there are ways to break up animals. If there's an animal that lives here in the environment behind me that dies, it's got lots of nutrients in its body, and other animals will eat that animal. So for example, a turkey vulture uses that beak in its bare head so it can dig apart the flesh of dead animals, which sounds pretty gross, but it helps convert that animal into the nutrients that trees and other plants are going to use. So they'll tear that off, tear open the flesh. Some of it they'll poop back out, and that poop becomes fertilizer for trees and other plants. They'll also break it down so that then smaller animals and insects and bacteria can break down the flesh and the meat even further in ways that can help the trees. And here, what are these things growing? Does anyone recognize? They're mushrooms. So mushrooms are the fruit of a fungus, and fungus helps also break down flesh and nutrients and get that into the soil to make a really rich soil that can support the life of a tree. And if you get down to the body of that fungus, it's not just the fruits, the mushrooms that you see, but this white fuzz are the mycorrhizal connections of fungus. They're these thin strands that connect the mushrooms that you see, but they also connect to the roots of trees, and they help trees absorb water and nutrients up into their roots. They even allow trees to share nutrients from one tree to another tree. So that's how fungus helps support the life of trees. So you think about all this life around us, the things we can see and the things we rarely see that are underneath our feet all of the time that are supporting the life around us. All right, so that's a bunch of ways that the life around us can support trees. How acorns grow into oak trees, but they really don't do it alone. They do it interacting with all these other plants and animals and fungus. But if you think about it, it's not just other things that are supporting trees. Life around is being supported by the trees. Trees are providers as well. Oak trees are giving out acorns, which become a food source, as we talked about already. So let's take another minute. If you could turn to a student next to you, talk about what are some ways, in addition to acorns, that trees are supporting people and other life throughout the oak woodlands, areas like this, areas where you might live. What are ways that trees can help support life? Okay, so let's wrap up in a few more seconds thinking about ways that trees can support the life around them. Okay, I'm gonna guess at some of the things you might have said. Um, First, we talked about acorns, so you know that people and animals are eating acorns. And in fact, acorns have been and continue to be an important source of food for Coast Miwok, who have been here for so many thousands of years, as well as for other people and lots of animals. We often see birds or squirrels collecting those acorns. Um, in addition to food, though, trees also give off oxygen. It's what we need to breathe. So all animals need to breathe oxygen, and trees are helping give that off, converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. Trees also help us by absorbing carbon from the air. So you know, you've heard about climate change and global warming. That's because of excess carbon dioxide that's gathering in the atmosphere from the burning of trees and fossil fuels and other human activities. Trees can help take that carbon back out of the air, bring it back into the wood, into the ground in ways that help keep the environment healthy. Um, Trees also provide other sources of food. It's not just the acorns, they're nuts, but a lot of animals like to eat oak trees, the leaves, other parts of them. And finally, there's a lot of shelter that they can provide. So let me show you some photos of how some of the other life around us benefits from trees, how these oak trees are providers for life. All right. So this first photo, you can see in that crow's mouth, what's it got? A whole bunch of acorns. It's gathering those acorns. Maybe it's going to eat them now, or maybe it's going to hide them and find them later, or maybe it'll hide them and lose one or two, which will grow into a new oak tree. And here you've got a cute deer nibbling on the leaves of a tree. So that's a coast live oak. Once the leaves get stiff and older and more mature, they're not very tasty, but the deer love the fresh new sprouts. So you'll often see oak trees where the bottom couple of feet are clear. It looks like someone's actually come through, like a gardener came through and cut all the branches off. It's actually because the deer will eat the new branches. Every time new leaves try to grow, they'll eat them as high as they can reach. And then the tree grows up above that, but stays clear down below. And here you've got a California sister butterfly, really beautiful type of butterfly that we have here in California. Um, and they will only lay their eggs on oak trees. So here again, we've got a live oak. This butterfly will fly around. It will eat the pollen and the nectar from the trees, but then it'll lay its eggs, like I said, only on oak trees. And that's because when the caterpillar hatches, when its eggs hatch and become caterpillars, they will eat the oak tree, the leaves. Then they'll become a cocoon and hatch into a new butterfly. Another animal that loves the leaves of oak trees are gall wasps. So there are thousands of species of insects that will lay their eggs on the leaves of oak trees. And it causes the tree to build, in this case, a pink star-shaped shape around that egg. When the egg hatches, it becomes larva. The larva will eat the inside of that thing that we call a gall. And then it will pupate and become a wasp. And that wasp, and these are just tiny little wasps that don't really sting. Some of them have a mild sting, but most of them don't even sting, will come out of that gall, live its life until it lays eggs on another oak leaf. So there's all kinds of life going on in these oak trees, some of it which you can see, like the birds and the deer, others which you have to pay really close attention to notice some of these things growing on the leaves. And if you think about oaks as a food source, again, humans have always used acorns as a primary source of food. So here, the Coast Miwok would use acorns. They would grind those acorns into a flour. This is a rock that was used. It's here at Olompali State Park. We call it kitchen rock. You can see all those curved bowl shapes in it that the Coast Miwok carved so they could grind acorns and other seeds into a flour to make breads and cereals and grains for food. So a really important source of food for humans as well. But also, as I said, not just food, but shelter. A lot of animals use oak trees for shelter. Here you've got a western gray squirrel. They're a type of tree squirrel, so they live and roost. Primarily, they nest in trees. This one was peeking out from about 20 feet up in a valley oak here at Olompali. We also have ground squirrels, like these 3 baby ground squirrels. They'll hide in trees, they'll climb trees, and then they often will nest underneath the roots. They'll dig holes in the ground and use the root structure as a place to dig their holes and have their babies, like these 3 that came running out from under an oak tree. A lot of birds will nest in trees as well. Woodpeckers can dig holes. So you see this hole there with the one that's a male acorn woodpecker poking his head out of the hole while the female is standing outside looking back in. And for them, a lot of birds really love dead trees. So it's important, not just the living trees and the life they bring, but even when they're dead, a lot of animals can use those trees as a place to live. Acorn woodpeckers will dig these holes. They'll have an entire family group. They'll share the hole. So it will be several moms, several dads, children who will stay around. Their chicks will grow, learn to fly, and then stay for several years and help those woodpeckers, that large family group of 15 or 20 birds, gather acorns, poke holes in the trees to save their acorns in, and then dig these bigger holes that they can all sleep in together. And the 1 and 2-year-olds will even help their moms and dads raise the new chicks, their siblings. But once they dig those holes, other animals will take advantage of them too. So on this very same tree, a month later, these starlings, a different type of bird, are there exploring those holes. So you see that big hole in the tree. A minute later, one of those birds flew into it, decided to check it out, see if maybe it could roost there, sleep there overnight. And then it got chased out by one of the acorn woodpeckers. But ultimately, starlings will use a lot of those holes. They'll use woodpecker holes to raise their own chicks once the woodpeckers have left. And that's a reminder again why we need to keep some dead trees as well. You don't want a dead tree that's going to fall over onto your house. But if a dead tree is up in the woodlands, it's really helpful to keep it there so other animals can use it. And oak trees also provide habitat for other plants. And here you see poison oak. It's a beautiful plant. So it's called poison oak. It's not actually an oak. It's a different type of plant. It's really beautiful. It in itself is a food source for many plants, or sorry, for many animals. It grows really healthy in oak woodlands and provides shelter and food for other animals. Now, humans usually don't like poison oak because it makes us itch. If you touch it, most people are allergic to it and will get really itchy, but other animals love it. So we have many animals that'll go to it for shelter. Birds will eat the berries from the poison oak. Coyotes, deer, quail will hide in it. They'll use it to make their dens. And turkeys will like poison oak as well. You'll often see here at Olompali turkeys walking around throughout the park. In the springtime, when they're mating, they'll puff up like this. They get that really red neck and their tails fan out. They look more like a cartoon drawing than a real bird, but they really are these wild birds that you can find here at Olompali and many places across California and really across the US. These wild turkeys that'll display in the springtime. Another common animal that you'll see here that thrives, does really well in the oak woodlands, are jackrabbits. So they are related to like cottontails and that type of rabbit, but they're a little bit different. They're more muscular. And we have a lot of these running around. And when you have things like rabbits and birds on the ground, you also get coyotes that will hunt them. So we don't see them that often. Coyotes mainly come out at night. They tend to be scared of people. Lately, though, they're becoming a little braver. Coyotes are seen around California more common in cities than they used to be. And that's okay. We need to be careful. You don't want to leave small pets out, but you don't want pets out alone anyways. And you don't want to approach them. You don't want to feed them. But if we stay back, keep our distance, they'll stay back from us as well. And you don't want to leave trash out where they're going to eat it. You want them to eat their natural prey, which are rodents, birds, rabbits, things like that. And when a coyote eats a rabbit or a bird, it might seem kind of sad because we've seen there's some beautiful animals here, like that jackrabbit. But if a coyote captures it, that's the way the coyote's going to thrive and it's going to live. And what's left of that rabbit might get eaten by the turkey vulture. And what's left after that might get eaten by insects and bacteria and fungus that'll help convert the energy, the meat from that rabbit, into the nutrients in the soil that are going to support the trees and the other wildlife. Which largely brings us sort of back full circle. How do you get a healthy tree? What supports different things and how do those animals all interact? But I want to talk a little more about one other animal that's part of this ecosystem, and that's people, humans, because everything we do impacts the ecosystems around us, just as the systems around us impact us. And it's important to remember that. It's always been that way. It always will be. What humans do makes a difference for the nature around us. And as I mentioned earlier, the people who have been here longest in California are the Native Americans. Here at Olompali, it's Coast Miwok. And there are still Coast Miwok throughout their ancestral lands here in Marin County, as well as Sonoma County, and Coast Miwok who have spread other places as well. And it's important to remember, they're the ones who have been here the longest, who have stewarded the land the longest, and lived here in ways that supported the healthy growth of oak woodlands and the grasslands and the nature that we see here. And the ways they did that were by harvesting, hunting, gathering, but always leaving some. So Coast Miwok have known that if you're gathering mushrooms, you don't take all the mushrooms. If you see that mycelium that helps the roots of trees gather what they need to leave them be, to help support that. And Miwok and many other Native Americans also used fire. There were cultural ceremonies and burns, natural or cultural burns, by lighting fires that would be low intensity. They could help clear the grasslands, clear space under and between trees so that they would grow back healthier and strong. So let's share some photos of what it's been like here for different people, the different people who have lived here at Olompali on the ground, the land where I'm standing now. So let's see. And in addition to the people who have lived here, some of the things they've done and the way they've stewarded the land. Because like I said, people are always having an impact on the land around them. So here we have some recreated structures called coaches that Coast Miwok have built historically to sleep in, to hold their acorn or other grains. More recently, these were built here at Olompali so you could get a sense of what it might have looked like for the thousands of years when Coast Miwok lived here before they were removed by the Spanish. Here's another type of cocha made of tule reed. These types of reeds grow along the edge of the bay and along the edge of wetlands. And remember how I said what we used to have here was the edge of the bay right up to the, where is now the freeway at the edge of the park. The last Coast Miwok chief here at Olompali also learned how to build adobe structures. He built this adobe building and was able to keep the land when most of the Miwok were removed from their land. Camila Yanisha, the Coast Miwok chief, was allowed to keep some of the land here at Olompali. He built this adobe structure, and it has now been part of it preserved underneath that tin roof. So if you come to visit, you can see that structure. More recently then, once it became part of California, the Coast Miwok and Yanisha were forced off, and the land was bought by a family. The Burdell family lived here for many years, and they built these sort of fancy looking gardens to make the land look nice, to be pretty, more flowers, but it didn't support the land as much. So they also would then plant things like the trees that you can see here on the left. And let's see if I can get, there we go. Over here, they had a walnut orchard. So they were still finding ways to extract from the land, to find food from the land. And they were stewarding those orchards, but not taking care as much of the oak trees and the ecosystems that had been here for thousands of years. But they did find ways to support the land, to support themselves, to get food from the land. And let's go. Here also another photo when the Burdells were here. And here on the right, you can see some cattle. So they had cattle grazing the land. While they weren't lighting fires anymore, there were no more introduced burns. The cattle did some of what fire had done by clearing some of the grasses. And you can still see a lot of space between the trees. If you look up in the hills there, look at the space between the trees and the grasses, even up near the top of the hill. That's similar to what existed probably for thousands of years when the Coast Miwok were here as well, where they cleared it with fire. Here's a building that got built by the Burdells, a wooden building around that adobe structure, but the adobe walls stayed up. And the Burdell family figured out that you could use the adobe for insulation, build their own wooden house around it, and still have the advantage of that coolness in the summers from the adobe. And eventually they built it out even bigger and made this stucco mansion in the early 1900s. And then later, it became a retreat center, and there was even a swimming pool here that's no longer here. But for a while, there was a swim club here in the 1950s. And then in the 1960s, the Grateful Dead lived here for 6 weeks. They were a rock band in the 60s and 70s. They're actually still around by slightly different name, and some of those people are still playing today. But here they were playing here at Olompali, and you can see some of those oak trees in the distance up on the hill. That's that same hill that's behind me when I'm speaking. So the Grateful Dead lived here for 6 weeks. They then would keep coming back. It became a commune where people lived here for several years. The Grateful Dead would play, as well as Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, a lot of the bands in the 60s from San Francisco. And you see those oak trees in the distance. I think it's actually one of those trees that ended up on the back of their album cover, one of their covers, because they really thought this was a beautiful place as well. They respected and loved those oak trees, the nature and the ecosystem around. Ultimately, though, the Grateful Dead, when they left here, in part it's because like they felt they weren't sure how they connected to the land, what their connection was here. And it helps me think about that too. How do we live with this land around us? What do we do that can support the ecosystems, the oak woodlands, and make sure that we're living in a way that can be harmonious with that? So that commune was here for a couple of years. There was a fire and one of those buildings burned down. Fortunately, everyone got out. But after that, it became a state park. And this is what it looks like now, where we've done a lot of protection, conserving the land. And a lot of what state parks has done historically has been that, protecting and conserving. But more recently, also paying more attention to actively stewarding the land, not just putting fences around things and saying we need to be cautious not to hurt the land, but thinking about what can people do to help preserve, steward, and keep the land healthy. That includes removing some of the invasive trees, clearing some of the land, and even using fire in some ways that we have learned from the indigenous people here, the Native Americans, ways to use fires that can make the land healthier again. And here's actually a photo of some state park staff who are working, doing prescribed burns, these low intensity fires, small fires that can help clear the land, make it healthier, and actually lower the chances of huge wildfires that can sweep through if you don't have these smaller, more frequent fires. And here we again, this is what the park looks like today. That's underneath a big valley oak tree looking down at that building that I'm standing in front of. In the distance, you have the marshland that used to be the bay, but is now marshland, and allowing some waters back in to get that sort of mixing of fresh and salt water that's important for that part of the habitat, as well as these grasslands and trees up behind me. All right, so thank you all for joining. We've got about 10 minutes or 8 minutes left for some questions. Let's see what we've got in the Q&A here. So I've got some questions about how do you plant an acorn? Can you throw an acorn and will it grow? So the short answer is maybe. If you plant an acorn, it might grow. Ultimately though, what does it need? It's gonna need water. It's gonna need healthy soil. It needs the right space and climate around it. If you planted one here, it might grow. If you planted one of the types of oak trees that live here, you planted an acorn from a coast live oak in Michigan, it wouldn't grow. It gets too cold there. It doesn't have the right climate. But here they might. And we often do have oak trees in our yards. Someone else asked, is that a red-tailed hawk we're hearing? No, but that's a good guess. There is a hawk that was screaming in the background, ew, ew, ew. And that's a red shoulder hawk. A red tail hawk makes more of a screech that in movies, often they use for bald eagles, but it's really the red tail hawk that makes that screech. And then red shoulder hawks make that repeated call. Let's see, someone else says, can you eat the acorn? So here's another acorn. Let me show you a few other acorns and tell you, you can't just eat it like this. So this is from a valley oak. This is from coast live oak, these smaller ones. They have tannins, which are really bitter and even a little bit poisonous if you eat too much. Tannins are also found in coffee and chocolate, but not as much as in acorns. Acorns have so much tannin that you can't really eat it. It would upset your stomach. But what you can do is grind them into a powder, soak them in water, and that water will leach out the tannins, and then you can eat them. And that's what the Coast Miwok have been doing for thousands of years, grinding up acorns, leaching out the tannins, and then you are able to eat them. And even now in some specialty food stores, you can find acorn flour. So there are ways that you can eat it. Let's see if we had a few more questions. How long does it take for an oak tree to grow? I would guess this one behind me, let's see here, let's turn this tree here could be 100 years old. Could be older, could be a little younger, but it's got to be probably at least 50 or 75. Within 10 or 20 years, you can get a pretty good sized tree, but they will keep growing for hundreds of years and get fairly large, especially some of the ones like the valley oaks get very tall. Some species of oak don't get more than 5 or 10 feet tall. So it depends on the type of oak. And they grow over different amounts of time as well. Let's see if we have a few more questions here. Can animals die by plants? Most animals, like when they evolve, they learn what they can or can't eat. And when you eat something, often they have this taste that warns you that they're poisonous. So just as humans have gotten pretty good at knowing what we can and can't eat, we know to be careful. We know not to eat things that taste too bitter. Most animals know that as well. So it would be really rare for an animal to eat a plant that's going to be poisonous to it. Let's see. And we've got time. Let's one more question. Have I seen poison ivy? Poison ivy actually isn't common in California. What we have here is poison oak, and I've seen it many, many times. It's really common throughout California. So it's an important reminder when you're on trails, when you're in nature, even if you're walking down the sidewalk, be careful, don't touch plants unless you know what they are, because some plants will make you itch or will have thorns on them. So poison oak is very common here, which I don't like if I'm brushing up against it. If I'm on a trail, I want to be careful and stay on the trail. But I love that we have poison oak here because I know the animals like it. It helps keep them healthy. So thank you all for those great questions. Thanks for tuning in, for learning about these acorns, the magical way they can become a tree and how that fits in with our diverse ecosystems and supports the diversity of California. Encourage you, check out some other Biodiversity Week events. Let me share a final screen that shows you where you can go to learn more about some of the other events going on through this weekend. There's some in person as well as online. So check out that link, California Biodiversity Day. See if you can find some other events. And if you are a classroom somewhere near Marin County, come visit Olompali State Park. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram or at our website. Hit the contact and send an email or a message. And we can find a time for school groups to get field trips set up here at Olompali. Thank you so much again for joining. Beautiful day here. I hope it is where you are too. Celebrate biodiversity by getting outside and seeing some of the life around you. Bye, everyone.